you who haven't come across me before, I've spent my entire working life pretty much dealing with temporary works, about 35 years now. I've spent my career working for major construction companies. The last 15 years, I've run my own temporary works consultancy. I'm a member of British Standards, so I'm on the committee responsible for writing the British Standard for temporary works. And on occasions, I have the privilege of advising and providing training to our friends at the HSE in the UK, and also the HSA, Health and Safety Authority in the Republic of Ireland, on temporary works matters. So I'm basically spent my whole career as a temporary works engineer. I've got about an hour of your time this morning, so my brief is to run through some of the procedural highlights of BS 5975 and provide a little bit of a clarification to one or two points. There are some commonly occurring questions that people keep asking. So I'll try and provide a little bit of clarification. Towards the end, I'll do I think I've got 2 or 3 slides on some more recent updates in the wider field of temporary works. And I think at the end, I think the idea, gents, is we have what, sort of 10 minutes or so for questions and answers, 10, 15 minutes or so. I think that's the sort of idea.
Yeah, I think it ran on a bit longer last time, but around that, yep.
Yeah, that sort of timing. Okay. So let's fire away. I'm hoping you're all aware we have a legal requirement within our industry, for example, under the Health and Safety at Work Act, to manage our jobs safely. Now, the Health and Safety at Work Act does not specifically mention temporary works, but it implies temporary works. So you could argue you cannot manage your job safely unless you're managing your temporary work safely. So the question is, how do we demonstrate that we're managing temporary work safely? Well, one way of doing that is to follow the recommendations of a relevant British standard for this subject. And BS 5975 is the standard. You can trace the history back to 1982. So the first version of this came out in 1982. They called it the Code of Practice for Forced Work. The 2019 version is the one I've been on a committee writing. The reason for the revision was to recognise new legislation and regulations, for example, such as CDM 2015, and also to reflect some modern changes in the way our industry works. Now, the aims of BS 5975 are in black in the middle there: minimise the chances of errors being made and maximise the chances that errors might be found, to ensure we have effective communication between the parties involved, and to provide an effective system for checking, and that is both on the design side and the construction, the implementation side. Now, the standard is written by a committee. So on the committee, we have, it's quite a large committee, we have representation from clients, so for example, Highways England, from major contractors, the likes of sort of Costains, people like that, subcontractors, temporary works designers, house builders. People often forget that when you're building houses, you'll get involved with temporary works. So scaffolding is the most obvious thing you see in house building. Equipment suppliers, people you will hire your temporary works equipment from. Specialist consultants, such as myself, and also representation from the Health and Safety Executive. So we're deemed to be a panel of experts. Now, the British Standard is not a legal requirement. British standards are not a legal requirement. What they are, it's a recommendation or guidance on best practice. And if your organisation chose to do temporary works differently, you're absolutely within your rights to do that. You don't have to do it as per the British Standard. However, because this is written by a panel of experts, we deem this to be the best way of managing temporary works. And your organisation might have to demonstrate that what you're doing is equal to or better than the requirements of the British standard. So I think it's fair to say what a lot of sort of senior management, directors in the company will do is say, well, look, let's write a procedure in accordance with the British standard, and hopefully the company and individuals within that company are covered. Okay, so this is one way of doing it. So let's look at some of the highlights and answer some common questions regarding 5975. Now, first of all, on the committee, we updated the definition of temporary works. If you're a regular on these sort of seminars, you will all be very, very familiar that things like formwork, false work, backpropping, scaffolding, trench boxes, crane foundations, I don't need to tell you they are temporary works. But what I thought I would do, just to set the scene, is give you maybe a few more unusual examples of temporary works. So if we look on the left-hand side here, protection, diversion, or perhaps supporting existing services, if we're working next to them or around them, that's temporary works. I'm sure Angus will agree, as an industry, Angus, we never ever hit or damage existing services, do we?
Ever, never seen it.
That is completely unheard of in the construction industry. It never happens. I always say it's embarrassing when you hit services you've put in, not somebody else, but you've put them in and then you hit them, or you hit the same one about 3 or 4 times. So protection, diversion, supporting existing services is temporary works. I'll do a little update later on, but in my opinion, one of the major or biggest problems we have with temporary works especially in the UK and Ireland is stability of reinforcement cages. As an industry, we are having a major issue with stability of reinforcement cages. You can see this particular cage is simply toppled over. Harris fencing. I'm forever being asked, is Harris fencing temporary works? Yes, it is, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah. And again, I'm sure Angus will agree, we never ever have problems with Harris fencing, Angus, do we?
I've never seen one of them blow over, never.
No. In my opinion, there's a special place in hell reserved for that stuff. The problem is, I think a lot of people tend to abuse it.
When they put the what's it called, the debris netting on it, that's when it becomes a real problem.
Yeah. Because in effect, they're simply making a sail, and as soon as the wind blows, it wants to fall over. And unfortunately, Harris fencing often has a direct interface with members of the public. Members of the public get hurt or injured, and they end up suing us. What about things like access, proprietary staircases? That's an item of temporary works. Precast, in particular, stability of precast units. Hopefully you can see there's a whole load of propping up against these precast units. They are there to provide stability. Similarly with steel construction, if you're building a steel frame, you may also have issues with temporary stability when you build a steel frame. Some of you may have seen there was an incident, I think it was in Hammersmith a day or two ago. It's in the sort of construction newspapers, where I believe it was a partial collapse of a steel frame, which may have taken a scaffold and some machinery down with it. I believe 2 operatives were very badly hurt and taken to hospital. There is a possibility, and I'm not saying I know anything about this, there is a possibility it may have been a temporary stability issue with the steel frame. Certainly that would be one of the lines of inquiry I would look at. Testing. People often forget we have a lot of temporary works associated with testing purposes. What you can see in the top right-hand photograph is a pressure test for a pipeline. And the temporary works is some fairly dirty lumps of steel and a very substantial lump of concrete in the ground called a thrust block. It just gives us something to push against when we're testing the pipe. Edge protection. Edge protection is temporary works. Often the problem here, it's not necessarily the edge protection system. It's not necessarily the steel beam there. That's the problem. quite often is the connection between the two of them. People also tend to assume that temporary works is only if we have to support the ground. So most people would recognise things like a sheet piled excavation or maybe trench boxes to be temporary works. What about if you've got a machine and you simply cut the ground? We do have issues with temporary stability of slopes and batters. Someone somewhere, for example, like Angus, needs to determine what's the safe angle that we can cut that ground to. And it does make a difference, ladies and gents, to the angle you cut the ground to if you want to park something heavy at the top of the slope. It could be an excavator, it could be a lorry delivering concrete. So slope stability is a temporary works issue. So the definition is it's an engineered solution used to assist construction. Generally, your temporary works are removed, but sometimes they are left in place. So what that means is on occasions, your temporary works may become sacrificial. And the reason they become sacrificial is possibly because they are too expensive or maybe too difficult to physically remove. And can I encourage you to think about this? If you do need to leave your temporary works in place, if at all possible, try and incorporate them somehow into your permanent works. Otherwise, in effect, you're throwing a load of money away. So try and incorporate it somehow into your permanent works. This is one that, again, a lot of people often forget about, the temporary condition of the permanent works. I'm hoping that's good use of English, but the temporary condition of the permanent works. So if you look at the photograph I provided here, in the finished condition, that bridge will be designed to span between the piers. What we're looking at here is a partially completed structure. In effect, we have two individual cantilevers with a load of equipment hanging off the end. As every engineer will tell you, something that spans behaves very differently to something that's a cantilever. So ladies and gents, please don't forget temporary works also includes the temporary condition of permanent. Now, let's look at a few highlights from the British Standard. Now, on the committee, when we rewrote this, we started off by saying, well, or let me rephrase that. Traditionally, it was mainly contractors that had temporary works procedures. So traditionally, all the big construction companies, the sort of the Balfour Beatties, Kears, Lang O'Rourke's, Costains, they all have temporary works procedures. But we recognise on the committee that there are lots of other organisations that get involved with temporary works, not just the big construction companies. That could include clients. There are occasions, and I'm sure Angus may have some experience of this, where clients have a direct input into the temporary works field. Because normally it might be people like Network Rail or Highways England or the nuclear people, those sort of organisations. What about people who design temporary works? Yeah? Well, they're definitely involved in temporary works. What about subcontractors? The companies you get to build your scaffolds or shutters or excavations for you, they're involved in temporary works. What about equipment suppliers? People you hire some of your temporary works equipment from. So any organisation involved in temporary works needs to have a procedure. Now, we do not want everyone to have the same procedure. So ladies and gents, please don't just go online, find the procedures from some major contractor, download it and change the logo. What works for Balfour Beatty or Kears or Costains probably wouldn't work for a subcontractor. Definitely doesn't work for a temporary work designer. There's no doubts in my mind wouldn't work for a equipment supplier. So you need to produce a procedure which is relevant to the type of work your company does. And the purpose of your procedure is to manage and control the type of work you're involved with, the temporary works that you're involved. Now, section 6.1.3 in the British Standard says, any organisation employing another organisation, so if you're subcontracting work out, you need to ensure that whoever you are subcontracting work to are also competent to carry out temporary works. So you have a responsibility to ensure your supply chain is competent. Now, I would hope that happens from tender stage. So you should be carrying out some sort of assessment of competency when you're asking people to price work for you. And if your subcontractor doesn't have a formal procedure, or if their procedure doesn't necessarily meet your requirements, then they should sign up to using your particular procedure. So one question I often get asked is, what happens if my subcontractor then further subcontracts work out? Well, you are responsible for your entire supply chain. So what I recommend to people is, whoever you're subcontracting work to, you should have a little clause in your contract which says, if you further subcontract work, you need to justify to us that whoever you are subcontracting work to, that they are competent to perform, what we want them to perform. Okay, so please remember, you're responsible for your entire supply chain. Now, in order for your organization to have a procedure, you need somebody called a designated individual. And for short, we call it a DI. Now, on the committee, we decided that the DI should be somebody relatively senior in your organization. So the wording is, it should be a member of or directly responsible to a member of the main board of your company. Now, the reason for doing that is because certainly one thing I noticed with one or two people was the directors of a company looked at temporary works and said, oh, that's a bit of a sticky wicket. Let's offload it onto the health and safety department. No, ladies and gents, we want the directors of a company to be responsible and accountable for what happens with temporary works. So the DI needs to be somebody senior in your company, or somebody who reports to somebody senior in your company. You can't just offload it onto, for example, your health and safety. And your temporary works procedure should be approved, should be signed off at main board level. And that's exactly the same as what happens with, for example, quality procedures, environmental procedures, health and safety procedures. One thing that really nagged me for a number of years was, I worked for various large organizations, and they were telling me, yeah, we've got an environmental procedure that's signed off by the main board. We've got a quality procedure that's signed off by the main board. We've got a health and safety procedure that's signed off by the main board. We also have a temporary work procedure, which isn't. In my opinion, I don't consider temporary works to be a lesser risk when compared maybe to quality or safety or environment. I would like it put at the same sort of level. Now, some large organizations will split the role of DI. So it's not necessarily a single person. Some organizations, the very biggest organizations, will have multiple DIs, and each DI may be responsible for their own operating division. So it's not unusual for the very largest organizations to have multiple DIs. Okay? But if you're a relatively small organization, I would expect you to have a single person of authority, a single DI. Now, section 6.1.8. Can I encourage you to consider this? Where your organization undertakes different roles. So what I mean by that is some organizations will wear different hats. You need a procedure to demonstrate how you're fulfilling your obligations depending on what hat you're wearing. I'll give you one example. I was doing some consultancy for a very large contractor. They have a turnover of getting on for about $1 billion. So they're one of the sort of larger companies. And what they said to me is 90% of the time, they are a principal contractor. However, once in the blue moon, they are a subcontractor. Okay? And by coincidence, they happen to be subcontracting to a company I used to work for, Kears. So they're a subcontractor. They have their own in-house temporary works design department. So they are a temporary works designer. They said they have a property division which in effect buys land and then they build houses on it. So they're a client, and they still own, and this is rather unusual for construction companies, they still own a lot of their own construction equipment. So I said, well, we've got some scaffolding, we've got some shuttering, we've got some cranes. And when we're not actually using our equipment, we will hire it to somebody else. So they're a hire company. So in theory, they wear 5 different hats. Ladies and gents, can I encourage you to consider how many different hats does your organization actually wear? And you need to demonstrate that you're fulfilling your temporary works duties depending on what hat you're wearing. So you might need slightly different procedures depending on what hat you're wearing. Hopefully that makes sense to people. Now, in the British Standard, we have set a precedence for procedural control, and we also recognise that the procedures may change during the life of a project. So what we've said is during the tender, design, sort of concept stage, it should be the procedures for the client or the principal designer that take precedence. And during that particular stage, we're hoping you're identifying the need for temporary works and trying to make life as easy as possible for us contractors. Yeah, that's what I'm hoping. Upon award of contract, whoever is the principal contractor, their procedures should take precedence. Now, once your structure, your building, whatever it is complete, you might have ongoing maintenance. So you may have a different set of procedures for maintenance. And maybe at some point in the future, your structure becomes redundant and we go into a demolition stage. You may have a completely separate set of procedures for the demolition stage. So I'm hoping, again, that makes sense to everyone, that you can change the procedural control depending on where you are in the life of a project. And this is one thing that often concerns me, is a lot of contracts may have very large M&E elements in it. How many M&E, mechanical and electrical companies, or indeed maintenance contractors, how many of those actually have formal temporary works procedures? A lot of, I've done a little bit of work recently for 1 or 2 M&E contractors, and I'm surprised how often they do get involved in temporary works. Here's one example. I'm not sure what this box is. It's some sort of piece of kit. They are moving it, to me it looks like on some sort of pallet trucks, across a suspended slab. Is that temporary works, ladies and gents? Yes, it is. Yeah, I'm sure Angus will back me up on this. They're putting quite a substantial point load onto this suspended slab. And there was an incident a few years ago, which is still being investigated, where they were doing something very, very similar to this. And the slab underneath actually failed because the point loads were, it was a car park slab, a suspended car park slab, which is designed for relatively light loading. You put a massive piece of machinery on top of it, basically on small point loads, and the slab underneath it failed. So how many of your M&E or maintenance contractors actually have a formal temporary works procedure? They do get involved in temporary works. Now, we mentioned that at tender and concept stage, we need to be thinking about temporary works. This comes from Regulation 9 of the CDM regs. Us contractors love quoting this. This is, I think, for us contractors, this is our favourite part of the CDM regulations, where designers, for example, structural engineers amongst you, need to take full account of any temporary works that may be required during construction. Now, that doesn't mean we want you to design or detail scaffolding. No, we're contractors, that's our business. Okay. But what we do want you to think about is buildability and, for example, working space. If I need to put up a scaffold on a project, please make sure there is sufficient room for me to build a scaffold if I need one. In my opinion, as an industry, we are getting better at this, but I think there is still quite a long way to go. Now, for contractors, I'm hoping you identified a need for temporary works during your pre-construction stage. So I'm hoping you're allowing sufficient time and money for any temporary works that you may require. Now, to be fair, I'm not expecting you to price every bit of fencing and stuff like that, but surely you've got to pick up on all the big items, haven't you? If you need a tower crane on your project, surely you need to allow a little bit of time and money to construct a foundation underneath it. And once we're on site, I would expect you to be using what's called a temporary works register. So I'm hoping by now most companies are familiar with the temporary works register. What it is, it's a tool to help you identify and manage temporary works more effectively. Okay? And I'm sure if you go online, there's lots of examples of company temporary works registers. I would expect you to be using a site temporary works register. Now, in order to manage temporary works, there are a series of appointments we have to make. Now, when I started in construction in 30 odd years ago, we had one appointment called a temporary works coordinator. Around about 14, 15 years ago, we introduced a second one called a temporary works supervisor. And in the 2019 version, we introduced a third appointment called a PC's TWC. I'd just like to spend a moment or two explaining the difference between them. First of all, temporary works coordinator. I'm sure one or two of you might be surprised to know the history of the role of temporary works coordinator can be traced back nearly 50 years. Been around since about the mid-70s. So it's not something that's new in construction. If you've never heard of a temporary works coordinator before, you're only 50 years behind the rest of us. It's been around for a long time. It's not new in construction. And the role of the coordinator, it's a management role. They are there to manage your company procedure. It does not mean they physically have to do the entire procedure themselves. So a very common comment that people make to me is they say, listen, I can't be a temporary works coordinator because I don't know how to design excavations. I don't know how to design scaffolding. Hang on a minute. If you're a coordinator and you're not competent to do the designer, your job is to make sure the design is carried out by somebody who is competent. You don't physically have to do the design yourself. If you're not competent to build a scaffold or drive a machine to dig an excavation, your job as the coordinator is to make sure it's being done by somebody competent. So it's a management position. I would expect every project to have a named temporary works coordinator. On some very, very large jobs, you may end up with multiple coordinators. So for example, things like High Speed 2, Hinkley, they will have multiple temporary works coordinators. Now, the other side of the coin is, if your company has 2 or 3 small jobs and they're all quite close to each other, maybe in the same town, you could have one coordinator who looks after 2 or 3 jobs. So you can mix and match it depending on the scale and complexity of the project you're involved in. But however, I'm not convinced it would be a good idea to have a coordinator looking after a small job in Southampton, another small job in Manchester, and another small job in Newcastle. I'm not convinced that would work particularly well. So, coordinator. It's a management position. Every project should have one. It's somebody who works for the principal contractor. I don't like it when people try, or when contractors try and offload that responsibility perhaps onto architects or structural engineers. I would always question why an architect or structural engineer would even entertain taking on that. Yeah? You're the contractor, it's your procedures, you've got to manage your own procedures. So hopefully that sheds a little bit of clarity on the role of the coordinator. It's a management position. Now, the role of supervisor. This is slightly more recent. It's been around for about 14 years or so. was introduced in the 2008 revision of the British Standard. And the idea is we appoint supervisors only if we think we need it. So some projects end up with lots of supervisors, some projects don't have any. There's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. Okay? The reason we appoint supervisors, I'll give you two good reasons. Number one, your coordinator is really busy and needs a little bit of help. Or secondly, your coordinator doesn't have certain skills and you want to bring somebody in with that particular skill set. And often it could be to do with things like inspections. Okay? So the difference between the two is coordinator, management position. Every project should have a named coordinator. It's somebody who works for the principal contractor. Supervisor, some projects have them, some projects don't. There's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. Okay. It's more of a hands-on practical role. And often your supervisors may work for specialist subcontractors, or they might be sort of independent experts coming into your site. So hopefully you're happy with the difference between the two. Now, I'll explain what PC's TWC is in just a second. Now, in order to make these appointments, we have to have a formal process. So we have to appoint the people in writing. We have to ensure they are competent to carry out the role, so they have sufficient experience, training, etc. We have to provide them with a job description, and hopefully the individual has the opportunity to sign to accept the appointment. And by signing it, in effect, what they're saying is, yes, I believe I'm competent to do this particular role. I'll explain what PC is in a second. Now, the appointments should be approved by your DI. Now, for some very large organizations, what happens is the DI sets up a framework under which the appointments are approved. If you imagine very, very large companies like sort of Kiers and Balfour Beatty's, you know, they could have thousands of temporary works coordinators. The DI is going to be pretty busy, you know, making all those appointments. So quite often they may delegate some of the duty, but they set up a framework under which this happens. And perhaps the most common question I'm asked is, what is the minimum level of competence we need for a temporary works coordinator? Well, that's an easy one to answer. There isn't one. Ladies and gents, I can't sit here and say to you, I think a temporary works coordinator must be at least 30 years old, must have a minimum of 10 years site experience, or must have a HND or a degree, or whatever. If you think about this, the scale and the breadth and the width of our industry, the training, skills, experience you need to work on Hinckley or HS2 are very different to if you're working for a utility company, fixing broken pipes, or if you're building houses. So there is no minimum standard. Okay? It's up to your organization to determine where your benchmark is going to be. And it can vary. It can vary depending on what type of work you're doing. Now, let's tackle the role of PC's TWC. So this is the one that was created in the 2019 version. And the way I'd like to explain it is to do a little example. Let's assume, ladies and gents, we have a project in the city centre. And our project is to build a concrete frame, which could be sort of a residential block of flats. And underneath that, we're going to have some sort of excavation. It could be a basement, maybe for parking. Okay. Now, the whole project will have a principal contractor. But what we're finding is most of the big principal contractors, in effect, they are management contractors. The big construction companies, they don't have their own equipment, they don't have their own labor force. They provide a management function. The work tends to be done by subcontractors. So, as an example, I'm going to split this job down the middle. I'm going to have one specialist subcontractor doing the sheet piling, the excavation, the basement for me. And then I'm going to have a different subcontractor doing the formwork, forcework, backpropping, or the block of flats. Okay. So what we have is a principal contractor. They have a DI who has written a temporary works procedure. Now, the principal contractor's procedure has to be all-encompassing because it has to consider scaffolding, excavations, sheet piling, cranes, formwork, forcework. It has to consider everything. Now, the principal contractor can appoint their own temporary works coordinator, and if they have their own in-house skills, they can appoint their own TWSs if they wanted to. But as we know, we tend to use specialist subcontractors. What I'm increasingly finding is more and more specialist subcontractors are writing their own temporary works procedures. And their procedures are very specific to the type of work they are involved in. So demolition subby will write a procedure to cover demolition. An earthwork subcontractor will write a procedure for digging holes in the ground. What we can do is we can see if we can get our subcontractors procedure approved for use on this project. That allows the subcontractors to use their own procedures and manage their own temporary works. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. So we're going to have a ground worker doing the basement for us. They're a subby. They have a DI who's written a very specific procedure for sheet piling and excavations. What you can do is send this procedure to the principal contractor's DI. The PC's DI can review the subcontractor's procedure. If they're happy with it, they can approve it for use on that particular project. And that enables the subcontractor to appoint their own coordinators, their own supervisors, and manage their own work. And we can do the same for however many different subcontractors we have on that particular project. Okay? Now, when we sat on the committee, we drew this out. We looked at this and we said, well, wait a minute. We can't have everyone called a temporary works coordinator. And we've got to make a bit of a difference up here. So we decided, we came up with a name called PC's TWC. And there's a really, really good reason we chose that name, because we couldn't think of anything better. Okay. I'll be honest with you, we tried lots of different acronyms and some of them ended up a little bit rude. So we thought, well, we can't call them that. Okay, so we opted for the PC's TWC. Now, if your organization wants to go down this road, you will be appointing PC's TWCs. And in my opinion, they have two very important roles to perform. Number one, they have to ensure that subcontractors are working to their own procedures. And I would suggest that should be a fairly robust audit process. You should audit what your subcontractors are doing. And secondly, it's something that I call managing interfaces. Let me give you an example of that. Your concrete frame subcontractor needs a tower crane with a foundation. Okay? Now, for logistical reasons, the only place they can put that tower crane base is up against the edge of this basement. Now, I'm sure Angus will agree here that that tower crane base affects the basement affects the tower crane base. I mean, let's be honest, Angus, they couldn't have picked a worse place to put it, really, could they?
No, not really.
No, but sometimes it, yeah, for logistical reasons, sometimes that's where it's got to go. There's nowhere else to put it. Now, the problem you're going to have, ladies and gents, if you're the principal contractor, is this your basement subcontractor is going to say, hang on a minute, my contract is to do this basement. That tower crane is nothing to do with me. I'm not interested in that tower crane. That is not part of my contract. Your concrete frame subby is going to say, oh, wait a minute. If you want me to build this concrete frame for you, I've got to have a tower crane. If you don't let me have a tower crane, I can't build it for you. But that excavation is not part of my scope of works. I know I can't see you, but I can almost feel every contractor on this course nodding their head, almost in synchronicity here, saying this happens every day of the week on site. Where this subcontractor says it's not my problem, and this subcontractor says it's not my problem. Well, ladies and gents, if you're the principal contractor, it is always your problem. So you now have to step in and manage these particular interfaces. Okay. So I'm hoping I've given you a little bit of clarity on the difference between a TWC, TWS, and a PC's TWC. Okay, so the option is there. If you trust your subcontractors and you're using a competent supply chain, you can allow them to manage their own temporary works, but you would have to audit what they're doing, keep them honest, and manage these sort of tricky interfaces between different packages. So I'm hoping that makes sense. Right, the next thing we've said, not all temporary works are the same. We recognise that some temporary works are relatively straightforward. There's not a lot of risk. We don't need a lot of management to manage the risks. Some items are devilishly difficult, very complex, a lot of risk. We do need a lot of procedures to manage. So in the new standard, what we're trying to do is to get everyone to speak the same language. Because previously, different companies use different systems. Some called it very low, low, medium, high. Some of them use numbers, some of them use letters. So we've gone for something called implementation class, and we're calling it very low, low, medium, and high. We're trying to get all companies to speak the same language. If you look at the two examples here, on the left, we have, in effect, a hired staircase. It's pre-designed, it comes with a book of instructions, it's very, very simple. We don't need a lot of paperwork and procedure to manage it. On the right-hand side, we have a major cofferdam for a power station excavation. It's in very, very poor ground. I would expect to see a lot of paperwork, a lot of procedure, bespoke designs, permits, inspections, RAMs, for what you can see on the right-hand side. But one thing to consider here, location can make a big difference. You could have exactly the same item of temporary works in a different location, and it could be deemed a different implementation class. So for example, a hoarding in the middle of a field, I would suggest is relatively low risk. The same hoarding in a city centre next to a railway line, I'm going to suggest is not low risk. Yeah. So I'm hoping you appreciate that the same item in a different location could be a different risk. Okay. So not all temporary works are the same. Now, one of the roles of the coordinator is to ensure a design brief is provided. Okay. There's nothing that says the coordinator has to write a design brief on their own. I think it should be very much a collaborative effort. And again, I can almost feel the designers on this session, sort of agreeing with me here. I'm sure Angus will. Every design brief, Angus, you've ever received has always had all of the information you could possibly want to carry out your design effect.
Well, if you mean a one-liner email, then yeah. Yeah.
Ladies and gents, you would be amazed how much time designers waste chasing information that wasn't on the original design. Now, I'm sure, Angus, if you said to your customers, look, do me a proper design brief, I'll knock 10% off my design costs. Honestly, they'd bite your fingers off, wouldn't they?
They would.
Ladies and gents, please encourage your people to have a proper think about design briefs. Your design, in effect, is only as good as the information you provide to your designer. And again, this is something people ask me. As a designer myself, I have no problems whatsoever if the TWC or somebody on site picks up the phone and says, look, I'm doing a design brief for you. Give me a clue. What information do you want? Yeah, I've got absolutely no problems with that at all. Yeah, in the long run, it probably makes my life a little bit easier. So please provide good design briefs. Now, the next concept we're going to introduce, all temporary works require a check. However, not all temporary works require additional formal calculations. So in the British Standard, we have another system, which we call design check category. And we use numbers here, 0, 1, 2, and 3. Okay? This is for the check of the calculations of the design. So category 0, what we're saying is you're going to hire a proprietary system. That means it's already pre-designed, it's manufactured to certain standards, it comes with in effect, an assembly manual. All you want is the second opinion that you're hiring the right piece of equipment. So again, apologies, Angus, I'm using you as a sort of assistant here. We're both on site, Angus. I want to hire a staircase. I've got the internet open or whatever. I say to you, Angus, look, see that staircase there? That's the one I want to hire. Just confirm it's the right piece of kit to hire for this job. Can you see, ladies and gents, we wouldn't necessarily need calculations. We wouldn't necessarily need to get a designer involved. All you want is a second opinion that you're hiring the right piece of kit. However, from category 1 onwards, we will need to start producing formal calculations and formal designs. So for category 1, if Angus designed it, somebody in Angus's team could check it. Category 2, if Angus designed it, nobody in your direct team could check it, Angus, but you could check it within your organization. So you might send it to another senior engineer in another team. And category 3, what often happens is Angus would send it maybe to a completely different company for an independent check.
Do you mind if I just butt in there?
Yeah, please do.
On category 2 there, you used a slightly different wording to what 5975 says. You said a different team, whereas that said...
Well, it's somebody not involved in the original design. So, yeah.
It's interesting because that's what I had someone ask me the same question the other day. Can it be someone in the same office, or has it got to be a separate office for a Cat 2? As long as they're not involved in the original design. What we want to avoid is, how can I phrase it, sort of cross-contamination of bad ideas. Is that a fair way of phrasing it? Yeah, I get the principle. It's more you specifically use the wording as separate office, which is what we always try and aim to.
Separate team.
The wording you used.
A better word.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I know with some companies, if you've got a massive sort of open plan office, you might have a team sat at one end of the office, the other team sat at the other end of the office.
Yeah.
That's usual. But not somebody involved in the as part of the original team doing the design. What we're trying to do is bring in sort of a fresh way of looking at it. Okay. And I would hope some sort of design check certificate may well be produced. In my opinion, this is quite an important piece of paper to, don't lose this if you're on site. This is quite an important piece of paper. Now, we get to the sort of the elephant in the room. Over the years, maybe one of the, maybe the most significant temporary works issue, and this just keeps reoccurring all the time. And this is going to come as a shock to the designers amongst you. On site, it's very rare that we build it 100% exactly as per your drawing. I'm hoping all the designers are sitting very comfortably at this particular moment in time. It may come as a shock to you, but on site, there is always something that doesn't quite work, doesn't quite fit, something gets in the way. Oh, we haven't ordered enough of this particular component. There is always some sort of problem for us to manage. Now, the tendency is for site teams to, by using inverted commas here, make it work. Yeah. Listen, we're going to make it work. I think that's quite a dangerous thing to do. Because in effect, Angus, they are taking design responsibility away from you. Yeah. So they pay you some money to design it. They build something completely different. In effect, Angus, they've given you a load of free money.
That's exactly it. Then I don't think they realise some of the times
the
changes they make.
If you start making changes on site, in effect, you are taking design responsibility yourself. So if you don't want to take that level of responsibility, please contact your designer and get some sort of check or approval for these sort of changes.
I would say it's getting better. Oh, sorry, Ray. I would say it's getting better though with people coming back with design changes now. A lot better than it was.
I've only been banging this drum for about 30 years, Angus. So we are getting a little bit better. And frankly, I don't care what you call it. You could call it a design change application. You could call it a RFI, request for information, site change request. I don't care what you call it. It could be a simple email. So you take a photograph, say, look, Angus, here's the problem. They might suggest a solution to you, Angus. They say, look, here's the problem. This is what we want to do to sort it out. Please confirm it's okay. Yeah. Honestly, it could be that simple. And please make sure any drawings are updated. Now, that doesn't mean you have to physically redo the drawing. It could just be put a bubble around it and see email from Angus dated 11th of May. So if somebody else picks up the drawing, they can follow the chain of events that has led to this. But please manage on-site changes. Now, once we've had the temporary works built, inspected, we've had any changes managed, we should have some sort of permit system. This is the main control measure we use on site to bring temporary works in and out of use. So the question I often get asked is who can sign the permit? Well, what the British Standard says is most permits will be signed by the temporary works coordinator, apart from simple items where we can delegate to an approved temporary works supervisor. However, one or two contractors have gone a stage further where their procedures say all permits have to be signed by the coordinator. And what a coordinator is signing for, in effect, is that the company procedure has been carried out correctly and they have the evidence to prove the procedure has been carried out correctly before the temporary works are loaded. Before you put your load on your scaffold, before you fill your shutter with concrete. Now, whilst our temporary works are on site, we may have a requirement for ongoing inspections. I'm hoping everyone knows things like scaffolding needs regular inspections. There are occasions where we have to do monitoring. And again, the designers amongst you may have specified certain types of monitoring that might be required. For example, if you're digging a big hole near a railway line, you might have to do track monitoring. In fact, I'd be very surprised if you didn't have to do track monitoring. Okay? And this bottom one here, this is one that I very rarely see. Maintenance. Some items of temporary works could be in use for many, many years. Yeah, I think a hoarding could be a good example. Yeah, it's not unusual for some very large jobs for the hoarding to be in use for 3, 4, 5 years. Is there a chance during that life that the timber, the plywood might need some sort of maintenance? So I would expect you to produce what's called a maintenance schedule. So I would encourage designers to think about what maintenance might be required, the people on site to produce a maintenance schedule. Now, this is the argument a lot of people say to me. They say, right, every Monday morning, somebody on my site goes round and checks the hoarding. Okay, that's fine. My question is, what happens if they find something wrong? What do you want them to do about it? That's your maintenance schedule, isn't it? Yeah. You might say, well, get a bar, rip the old plywood off. This is the new plywood sheet we're going to use. Would you need to tell them how many, what screws or nails to use? Would you need to tell them how many screws or nails to use? That's your maintenance schedule. Now, over the years, I think maybe I've seen 20 temporary works maintenance schedules. I reckon I've written 19 of them myself. Okay? It's something that I very, very rarely see on site. I'm not sure if Angus has any particular experience of this, but it's something that people often forget about. Yeah? They put it up and assume it's just going to stay there forever, and it doesn't need any TLC.
Then it goes on the drawing as a list of notes and things to monitor specifically. I don't think I've done a full schedule, to be honest, but I've done a itemised list of what they need to check and when. So please, designers, people on site, please think about a bit of tender loving care for your temporary works going forward. And finally, once you finish with your temporary works, hopefully you have something called a permit to remove or permit to strike. What you're saying here is that you don't need your temporary works anymore and we can remove it. My single biggest pet hate with temporary works, and ladies and gents, this winds me up an absolute treat,
is when people give me method statements, I always look at the back page first. What I'm looking for, it says removal, and often there's just one sentence. It says reverse of installation. If you ever see that, ladies and gents, put it in the bin. What you're holding is recycling. I want to see a proper removal sequence. So just to summarize, I was asked by the HSE quite a few years ago. I was doing some training for them, and at the top, with temporary works management, if you're on a very large project, I would expect to see formal procedures, basically the whole of 5975 being used. If you're on a relatively small, simple job, it probably doesn't warrant having a massively complex procedure because your risks are not going to be massively complex. So maybe all you need is the principles of 5975. And then the HSE asked me for a top 6 questions that they need to ask when they visit sites. I actually gave them 8. Okay, so be warned, ladies and gents. Do you have a DI and a formal temporary works procedure for use on this site? Have you assessed competencies of people and companies involved in temporary works? Who is the named coordinator? What is their background competence? Can you justify that you've got the right coordinator for this particular project? Do you have a temporary works register? Is there a design brief? Has the scheme been designed? Has that design been checked? What inspections have been carried out to ensure you built it as per the design? If your temporary works are there for a long time, are you inspecting them and maintaining them? And how are you going to load and remove your temporary work safely afterwards? Okay, so just for the last 2 minutes, can I give you another couple of quick updates? First of all, BS 5975, we're currently working on the 2022 revision. In 2019, we revised the procedures bit. We're now working on the design bit. The current thinking is to split 5975 into 2 parts. There will be part 1 will be the procedures, part 2 will be the design. My expectation is part 1 is going to be the bestseller. Part 2 is going to be specialist reading. Okay. There are going to be some very minor changes to the procedures bit. It's not a root and branch rewrite, but there will be significant rewriting in the design section. We're going through comments from the committee at the moment. I can't give you any precise dates, but the document will be published for, it's what's called DPC, Draft for Public Consultation. The best I can say is in the near future. I'm afraid I can't give you a precise date, but it's in the near future. So, you know, there will be a new version of the British Standard, hopefully later this year. I'm hoping many of you have heard of Temporary Works Forum. There is a working group within Temporary Works Forum where we are working with CITB, Construction Industry Training Board, on updating and renewing a lot of their temporary work training and exams. What we're pushing for is, in my opinion, the role of the coordinator. It's not just a health and safety role. You know, you're not just somebody who collects paperwork. You really need to understand some of the risks, the technical risks involved with temporary works, simply so you can question what's happening on site. So we're looking to try and raise the technical awareness, give tutors a little bit more flexibility to suit the course to the type of delegates that turn up. I'm hoping you all appreciate, if I have a classroom full of ground workers or a classroom full of scaffolders, the type of course I deliver should be substantially different. So give tutors a little bit more flexibility. We would like CITB to provide names of trainers. So if somebody's advertising a training course, to provide the name of the trainer. that allows customers, potential customers, to look at who's delivering the course and see if it's the right person to train their particular people. Now, some of you might know there is a temporary work general appreciation training course in CITB. There is a possibility that will be defunct because Temporary Works Forum have created their own online version. Some of you may have seen it, may have already been on it. I've seen some really good reviews for the online Temporary Works Forum course. The CITB training is increasingly becoming an industry standard. It's starting to be a requirement on some projects, and major clients are also looking at their own procedures and how they select and manage their supply chain with regard to temporary works. So it's sort of flavour of the month. Professional indemnity insurance. This is something I spoke to Angus about, just before we came on. The cost of premiums is ever increasing. As a result, what's going to happen is, I think there may become fewer and fewer companies wanting to take on temporary works designs, simply because they may not be able to justify the cost of it. That may lead to a sort of a lack of people wanting to do it. Okay, and I think it's very important for you people to make sure that you've got evidence of your design as PI, and please look very, very closely at exclusions. The underwriters are starting to become increasingly strict and clever with exclusions. I'll give you one example. Now, I must admit, I didn't personally see this, but I heard this from somebody else. They employed a scaffold subcontractor to build scaffolding. One of the exclusions in the scaffolder's insurance was work at height. Yeah. How does a scaffold company build a scaffold if you've got an exclusion for work at height? Yeah. Angus, I'm guessing somebody didn't really read the small print.
You'd say so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Well, they paid for it.
Well, the guy told me when the director saw it, he nearly had a stroke.
Yeah.
Nearly fell off his chair. The last one, can I just for a couple of minutes, we mentioned a very significant problem in our industry is with rebar stability. The Temporary Works Forum, we're producing guidance on this. Some of you may have seen the part 1 on rebar stability was published about what we're looking at 18 months ago. It's a management guide. We're working on part 2 at the moment. Part 1 is basically to highlight the problem, just raise awareness of what the problems are. Part 2 is going to be technical design guidance. So we're going to, actually provide guidance on how to design these things. We are looking to produce example calculations, so you can follow through a step-by-step example of how to do this. Details of loads to be considered, details of potential solutions, factors of safety, and we're going to introduce 2 concepts for tying rebar together. First one, positional tying. What we're saying there is all we want the ties to do is hold the bars in place long enough so we can pour concrete all over. So we don't want the ties to really work very hard. The second tie is we're going to call it structural robust tying, and there we want the ties to do quite a lot of work. Now, maybe because we're lifting the cage, maybe we're trying to provide stability. It could be sort of connections to starter bars. And for the robust tying, the structural tying, we're going to be suggesting an option where you can do your own on-site testing of ties to determine your own safe working loads for how much load can a tie actually carry. We're working with some partners at the moment to develop a piece of kit that you can either hire or build yourself. It's basically just going to be made out of R&D type soldiers, and you can do a little bit of your own on-site testing. Okay, apologies, I've gone on a little bit longer than I intended, but hopefully we got 5 or so minutes for some questions.
Much for that, Ray. I think we've got,